Okay, this screencast focuses on the modules and external APIs lesson in the Pico Labs documentation. Okay, so what I'm going to try to teach in this screencast is mostly kind of the reasons why you'd want to use a module, what it looks like, and give you a little taste of how to make it. I'm not going to go through everything that this lesson talks about, so it'll be still important to hit upon all those different points as you go through the lesson, but I'm hoping to give you just kind of the general idea of what a module is and what it looks like. Okay, so first off, a module is pretty similar to an import in other languages, or like some sort of include statement in like C++. So you can think of a module like an external library of some code base that has functions or actions that you want access to and don't want to write yourself. Okay, so just to give you a little example, here's just a project I was working on for a different class. You'll notice that there are different imports at the top, right? So there's the array list library, there's the observable library, etc. And I don't want to write all that myself, so I just import it and I end up using it in my code. So we're going to do something pretty similar. In fact, if you look in KRL, the syntax for that looks something like this. Okay, we're using a module, and we have the option to give it a kind of shortened name if it's a really long name. And I'll give you a little insight into what that looks like in just a minute. There are two primary use cases for using modules. Okay, the first use case is if you're writing some application or some rule set, and it ends up just being really big. A good example of this is Wrangler. Okay, so this is essentially the operating system for Picos, and you'll notice that it's pretty large. It's a good solid 600 lines of code. But this actually isn't all of Wrangler. We ended up breaking it into smaller parts. For example, the subscription rule set, if you click right here, it's the one we were just looking at. This one is another 400 lines of code, right? But conceptually, you can kind of think of them as kind of independent. So we decided to split those into different sections of code to make it a little bit easier to read. So that's the first use case for a module. The second use case is the one that this lesson focuses on, and it's really the one that we want you guys to understand a little bit better. So that's when you're using an external API, okay? So just a little recap. An API is essentially, what does it stand for? Let's look that up. Let's see. Okay, application programming interface, right? So the idea is you've got some code base that does something, and you want others to be able to use your code. So you define an API or a programming interface so that other people can call the functions and actions and whatever else that you're defining for them. Okay. A good example of this is the movie DB. I don't know if you've heard of it, but essentially it's a community-built movie TV show database, essentially. But they provide a good API for anyone who just wants to access this database. All you got to do is get an API key so they know who's making the requests, and you can ask for all sorts of information. You can get a list of the current popular movies, you can search for movies, you can search for TV shows, whatever it is. You can rate stuff as well. That's a lot of fun. But the idea is that the API allows you to access someone else's code. Okay. If you're using something like Java or Python or something like that, people like the MovieDB or like Twilio, which is a texting service, they'll usually provide libraries that you can import yourself. Let's take a look at the Twilio, for example. If I just look up the Twilio docs, let's just click on this one right here. Let's go to SMS. Once again, Twilio is essentially just like a texting, messaging, phone call service that you can use. So if you want to send a text via code, for example, Twilio is a good option to get that going. You'll notice right here on the left, they have Getting Started section. They've got .NET Framework Quick Start. They've got Java Quick Start, Node, Ruby, Python. And if we just click on the Java one, for example, you'll notice it's very similar to like an array list, importing an array list, right? You import the Twilio code base, and that will include also maybe some classes or otherwise. And essentially, you just use that directly in your code. Now, you'll notice that when it says twilio.init, you don't have to write all the different code that sends the text messages. You don't have to do any of that. You just have to use the library as they've specified. And that's the goal of this screencast. That's the goal of our using API modules, okay? So just to give you a little flavor, here's a little diagram that I made. You can imagine here's the internet. You've got the API in the cloud somewhere, right? That's just represented by this little rectangle. And our KRL is going to essentially look like this. We're going to have 3 rule sets, okay? We're going to have one rule set, which is essentially that that wrapper rule set that Twilio or the MovieDB would have provided for you if they had a KRL library. So this rectangle right here is essentially going to be this import statement. We're going to have a rule set that stores our API keys so that we can essentially load their library and provide all of our necessary API keys to that library. And that's essentially what they're doing when they init it right here. They're providing an auth token, which is essentially an API key, and their SID, which is talking to the referring to the account that you created with Twilio. Okay. So finally, we have your KRL application. Okay. So if you're making like a movie recommendation app on Android or something, this would be essentially your app. But for our case, this is going to be a KRL app. All right. So I went ahead and created a rule set called my Amazing Movie App. Okay. You can ignore all the code down here. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But you can see right here, we're importing those functions just like the Twilio example is using them over here. We're essentially, let's go back to that. The first thing we want to do is get the keys. Now in the Java example, they just declare a string at the top of their file. For our purposes, you'll see why we're doing it separately. It talks about that in the lesson, so I'm not going to go over it too much. But we have a separate rule set that does that. I'm not going to show you that rule set because it has my actual API keys in it, and I don't really want to blur them out in the video or anything like that. Let's see here. The next thing you do is you import essentially their library. Now, it hasn't been written yet. Right now, it's really just a stub. Nothing's in here yet. But you'll notice that I'm taking the keys provided from my keys rule set, and I'm essentially passing it into this module that I'm importing. I'm using the MovieDB library with an API key configured to be the one provided from this rule set. Okay, you can look up the syntax in the lesson as well, so I'm not going to talk about that too much. But you'll notice that inside this library rule set, it's configuring that API key to essentially just be blank. Okay, so if someone tries to use this and they don't provide it, it'll at least have it defined and it's set to some default value, in this case the empty string. Okay, so I want to show you how to build this little library rule set. Okay, that's what you're going to be doing for one of the labs or the lessons. So I wanted to use the MovieDB as an example just because I thought it's cool. Here's their API documentation. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and walk you guys through what this looks like. All right. So the first thing you want to do is find the base URL. Okay, the base URL is essentially where their API is located on the internet, and generally speaking, you take that base URL and you just append kind of like a path onto it that defines what function you're trying to call on their API. So let's look at the movies list. Okay, let's just go ahead and try to get a list of popular movies. Okay, so this is a HTTP GET call, and it would have some sort of base URL defined right here. But all they do in this documentation is define the the pathway that's appended to that. So we still need to find the base URL. Let's look at, if you hit try it out, okay, you'll see right here is the full URL that they're calling, and you can actually get the pathway from that. So let's just take that right here, copy that. Let's go back to our MovieDB. Let's go ahead and define that. Base URL equals a string. Paste that in there, okay? And now whenever we're making API calls in this MovieDB rule set, we can essentially just refer to this base URL without having to copy paste it 100 times. If we were making a module that was very comprehensive, we would essentially start making functions for every single GET call that you see here and allowing all the different parameters and everything that you can pass to it. You'll notice that the definition here, this API is really well. This is another reason why I wanted to use it. It's documented very, very well. It tells you everything that you need, all the different responses that you could get, whether it's OK, whether it's a 401 or a 404. And it tells you the results. So it's really well documented. But the only required thing that they want from us is essentially an API underscore key. Okay, so let's get this pathway going. Let's write a little function. So let's say get popular is assigned function. For now, let's just not take any parameters. And we're going to want to make an HTTP GET call. Okay. And we're going to want to get the, let's see, it's the content from that. And the content's just going to be a string, so we want to decode that into a KRL map. Okay. Now, I'm going to just give a string in the HTTP library. You can look up the library on the documentation. It tells you essentially how to make posts, how to make GET calls, all the different options you can provide, etc. Okay, so let's go back here. I just need to provide that pathway, so let's do that. I'm essentially going to want to use the base URL followed by a slash movie slash popular. Okay, and then they want that API key. All right, so let's add that API key. Let's give it a question mark. We say API underscore key equals, and we're going to use that API key we're configuring. Okay, let's copy that. Okay, so now we've got this function that essentially just makes an HTTP request to the MovieDB API. All right, and let's go ahead and make sure we provide that function. Okay, so when you're using a module, you want to make sure that you have this provides keyword at the top, because some rule sets may have functions or user-defined actions that you don't want other people to be able to call, even if they're using your rule set as a module. So you essentially have to explicitly define or specify which functions you want other people to have access to. So that's what the provides keyword is doing right here. I want other people using this rule set to be able to call this function. Let's register that. And you'll notice in my amazing movie app right here, I'm already using it once again. And then you come down, I already have this function that essentially just wraps that call, okay? I'm referring to that library that I'm importing at the top, and I'm calling that getPopular function, okay? So I went ahead and added that to the testing tab. So let's go ahead and open up my MovieDB rules Pico. Go to the testing tab, click on that, and let's just give this a shot, see if it works. Okay, and if you look right here, you'll notice we got that response. It's got quite a few movies in there. It tells you the page number it is, so if you want to do pagination, it tells you the total pages. It gives you results, which is key to an array, and that essentially just has a bunch of movie objects. Okay, so the first movie you can see is Captain Marvel, the second movie is How to Train Your Dragon, etc. Okay, so it looks like that call's working. So already I've essentially got this application that's using the MovieDB module, right? And it's making any given calls that you want. Once again, if this was more comprehensive, I would go through every single API specification, and I would make a function for that in KRL, and I would essentially just kind of wrap all the possible things. Now, one thing you could do, I'm not going to do that right now. You'll notice the page parameter. If I wanted to, I could specify like a page. If you wanted to do pagination, and then essentially you could request, instead of the first page, you could request the second page, right? But I'm not going to talk about that right now. Let's talk next about user-defined actions, okay? So if you want to make an HTTP GET call, all you have to do is do it in a function. That's fine. But if you want to use a KRL action, like if you want to create a new text message, for example, or let's use a MovieDB reference. If you want to rate a movie, okay, we're actually altering something on their database. So this isn't just something you can do in a function, because in KRL, we don't want to have side effects in functions. Okay, we don't want to change state or anything else. We just want to query things. So if we want to be able to have a side effect, we need to use a def action. Okay, so let's make a little user-defined action, excuse me, called rate movie, and that's just defined like this. Okay, we're essentially rating a movie. It's a user-defined action. And now people, whenever they have a rule, they can call this def action inside the action block. Okay. Now it's screaming at me because we have to actually make a call. Okay. So you'll notice that post is one of those things that has to be used in the action block. Okay. So you can't make an HTTP post in a function call. You have to do it in a def action. Now let's just kind of do a similar thing right here. Let's get those bee stings going. Let's get, let me just take a second as I look at my notes. Let's see here. We're going to want that base URL again. Okay. Let's look at their documentation. So it's /movie ID /rating. Okay. So /movie the movie ID is going to be some sort of dynamic variable. So let's just say movie ID, right? What was it again? It was rating. Okay. Rating. And then of course we need the API key once again. Now that would be all that we need, but you'll notice that most services that use some sort of post call, they need something more than just an API key. They need some sort of user ID. Because when we're talking about the movie database, right, you sign up for an account, and the idea is that when you rate a movie, you're the one rating it, right? It's not just some community global rating, it's you who rated this specific movie. So they need to identify who is the user that's rating this movie, okay? And you'll notice at the top, there's a little statement here. It says a valid session or guest session ID is required, okay? That's how they identify the user that is essentially rating that movie. So you'll notice down here, it does say optional, but you have to have one or the other. I'll just give a session ID just as an example. If you're a little confused about this still, that's okay, because ultimately, if you were making an application like a single page application or like a web app or something, or maybe an Android app, you would have like that first login page, right? That would ask you to log in, and then after you log in, then you'd be all set to rate different movies. But that session ID would come from logging in or from registering. So let's just add a session ID here. Okay, let's add the little ampersand. And if you're not familiar with the syntax, this is called a query string. Okay, you can look it up. This is just how you pass different parameters in. Some APIs request that you do different things, but for this we'll just do the query string like this. Okay, so ampersand, we want a session underscore ID equals, and let's give it a session ID. Okay. Now, we need to actually get these variables from somewhere, right? So let's go up to here. Let's say movie ID and session ID. Now keep in mind that this is the library rule set we're working on. So we don't really know how the application is going to get the session ID or the movie ID. And we don't really care, honestly. We just want to essentially accept it as parameters. Okay, so let's see what else I'm missing. Of course, we need the, if we're rating a movie, we got to rate it with some sort of value, right? So let's see. Right here, request body, okay, they want a value. Okay, this value is the rating you want to submit. The value is expected to be between 0.5 and 10.0, okay? So let's go back to there. I need some sort of rating, okay? And I would, if I wanted to make this a little hardened, very defensive programming, I would do some sort of validation to make sure that rating was in fact between 0.5 and 10. But for now, I'm just going to kind of trust it. Okay. So just looking at their API again, they're requiring that we provide it as an application/JSON, okay? You're going to want to be careful about how you provide the value or the information because you can't provide everything in a query string, okay? Different APIs will require that you do different things and you kind of just have to play around with it until it works. Some APIs aren't that great at documenting it, so you have to be careful about how you're doing it. But if you're essentially making the call and you're not getting any result or response back, that's probably one of the first things you want to check. So let's provide the request body. If we look at the HTTP documentation again, you'll notice that there's a JSON thing. Okay, data to encode the HTTP body as JSON. Okay, also setting the application/JSON header. All right, that's exactly what we want. So let's go ahead and provide that. So comma. This is the second parameter to the HTTP post call. JSON equals some object, right? And we want the value to be keyed to the rating that someone is providing, okay? Let's go ahead and register that. Now you saw the get popular example work. I'm not going to go to the effort of making the rate movie work because that would require getting a valid session ID, and that's a little bit too much work for this screencast. But if you go over back to that rule set, amazing movie app, you can see how I'm using it. I've got this rule, and it has to be a rule because only events are allowed to have side effects, right? And I'm calling that user-defined action in the action block. I'm rating the movie, and I'm just essentially passing the information along, okay? So this is essentially just a very quick summary of how modules and external APIs work. Once again, I didn't talk about everything that the lesson goes over, so make sure you still at least read through it. For example, it tells you what the keys rule set actually looks like and what you're supposed to put in it. So just kind of use that for reference, but I hope this screencast helped you get a better view of what modules are used for.